Hello, and welcome to the Dissonance Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. This week, we are sharing our book club meeting with James LaRue, author of On Censorship, a public librarian examines cancel culture in the U.S. In this both serious and fun episode, Jamie shares his insights, personal reflections, and examples of book challenges. He also shared useful advice and hopeful success stories with regard to community outreach. In the show notes, you can find a link to the 4 brief book club episodes that preceded our meeting with the author.
So let me just say a couple things. One, thank you for saying American Library Association and Office of Intellectual Freedom instead of the acronyms.
Right.
It's one of my greatest pet peeves about the American Library Association is they're always using acronyms and don't tell us what they mean. So
Right.
For the audience, if we say ALA, we mean American Library Association. If we say OIF, we mean Office of Intellectual Freedom. I just also, in case people aren't aware, when Jamie talks about the surge, it's completely unprecedented. There were 10,000 challenges, I think specifically in school libraries, I saw during the last school year.
But Pam, I was thinking about this the other day. Is that I'm not sure many people know about this. Mississippi passed a law where they said that if anybody is in the digital production, digital content realm, they have to sign something assuring that no one under the age of 18 is going to see any sexual content, because that's defined as harmful to minors in the legislation. There's a penalty to it. And this definition now is getting so specific about anything to do with LGBTQ, masturbation, anything to do with human sexuality. Well, of course, the 2 big digital content providers for libraries are Overdrive. Most of these audiobooks are there, and ebooks, and Hoopla. Together, they encompass 3.5 million titles. Neither one of them would sign that agreement. And so effective 2024 in the state of Mississippi, 3.5 million titles have been removed from access for an
Wow.
minor. That's incredible.
It is unbelievable. It's I didn't know that. That's amazing. Yeah. So this is where we are.
This is where we are.
I think, I do think that we're seeing this at all levels, that you just said it's incredible. And because it was so incredible, we didn't plan for this. You know what I mean? It's like, we don't think these things can happen until they happen. And, there's just no grassroots organization that can match that. Then it's too late. It takes on too much momentum, and it's really hard. It's really hard to go back, and so awareness is like number one. This is one of the reasons we wanted to read the book. You specifically mentioned right-wing organizations and stuff. I think I personally have more experience with more left-wing challenges.
Interesting.
But I'm not a librarian. But I'm just wondering, what experience you have or thoughts you might have on challenges that come from more progressive.
Well, I think that I definitely have received challenges on both sides. And one of the things that I kind of got to as an understanding of what the role of the library is in American society. We reflect our culture. And that reflection means that mostly we're looking at decisions that were made a long time ago. So you look in a mirror, you see all the choices you made for your body. When you look into a library's collection, you're seeing 15 to 20 years worth of collection development within a library. And so we're reflecting mostly the past. And mostly the past in American society means that it's been straight white publishers, and that's who dominates the publishing scene for a long time. Only in the past 5 to 10 years are we seeing any significant growth in previously marginalized voices. So it's LGBTQ, it's people of color, it's the disabled, it's folks that had a lot of trouble finding their way into the publishing world. All of the challenges that I receive are about the 3%. And so mostly that means that straight white folks are saying, I don't like the way that our society is changing. fend off these new voices and let's go back and just, encourage the maintenance of our national identity that reflects the past. On the right, or excuse me, on the left, what I'm saying is we don't have nearly enough information that reflects current demographic majorities or large minorities. And so, A, buy a whole lot more stuff, whether it's available or not, to public libraries. And while you're about it, let's go back and purge these old books from hints of racism or bigotry, and let's start policing all of that language so that it reflects just the viewpoint of this very narrow group of American society. And so I feel like, yeah, we get it from both sides. And our job is to say we track social change, which comes from the fringe, right? Change doesn't come from the mainstream, it comes from the sides. So everything we're adding to the collection, all these new voices, are stirring up people at both ends of the continuum and presenting kind of a challenge for the rest of us who are somewhere in the middle.
So yeah, one of the things that I was telling Elizabeth that I recently read Amanda Jones's book. It just came out called That Librarian. And for those who aren't familiar, she was very heinously targeted in her hometown in Louisiana. She was a school librarian and spoke out against censorship at the public library. And people started making up lies about her, saying she was a pedophile, and
right.
It's a tough story to read, especially if you're a librarian. And she said it seemed to her that only Republicans were book banners, but I'm sure it seemed that way to her.
That is not true. I can remember that, I too have had these kinds of things at public meeting where somebody say you're a pedophile, you're grooming children, these are harmful materials, this is obscene content, it's illegal. They've reported me to the sheriff. Every one of the 6 municipalities, the police departments have had to come to the library and see if we're doing anything obscene. But I remember when I was still working at the American Library Association, there was a hot controversy that had to do with meeting rooms. And we were asked at the Office for Intellectual Freedom, if somebody calls you from the Proud Boys and they say, we want to meet at the public meeting room, can we do that? And it's absolutely clear as a matter of law that yes, they can. If you make the meeting room available to anyone, you have to make it available to everyone under the same circumstances. And the people that were kind of rising up in this belief of social justice at the American Library Association, they were livid. They said, well, we can't say that. We have to say, no, we're going to shut them down. And it's like, well, what about that value of free speech? How do you uncover something? And they say, no, we just have to silence them. And so I feel like just as a librarian who might be middle of the road or liberal is deeply offended and hurt by saying you're a pedophile, in much the same way, I've seen the left label somebody to say, well, if you're going to allow, the KKK to meet, then you are a racist. And that is just as painful and just as pointed as it would be coming from the right.
Yeah, it does. The attacks do come from both sides. We can see currently. It does seem like they're only coming from the right, but we know that they come from the left. And one of the things that I've talked to Elizabeth about too is a case in Maine. It was reported in the New York Times earlier this year. Blue Hill Library in Maine got a challenge for the book Irreversible Damage, the transgender craze seducing our daughters by Abigail Schreier. And what I found most disturbing about that story was that the director reached out to the ALA and they ignored him.
I read about that.
So again, it really comes down to this. That's, I think, my biggest question. How do we walk that line between free speech and our social justice values? I do believe in social justice. I also believe in free speech.
So do I. Well, and I think one of the kind of dangers of our time is that everything is defined as that you have to be on one extreme or the other. And it is often the case that we have multiple values, and it kind of depends upon the circumstances. Like, well, which one of these is weighted a little higher than the other one? And I feel like, one of the things that I tried to focus on in the book is that instead of just adopting the techniques of slash and burn and attack, how do we find a way to get to meaningful conversation? And I think that typically begins with more questions than trying to lay out kind of arguments and trying to understand personal stories, because that's how we connect with each other, hearing each other's stories rather than assertions that may or may not have evidence behind them.
You do have some great stories in the book,
thank
and
you.
we did talk about some of them in the and one, very successful story where a woman asked you about a book, a children's book that she felt was racist, or had racist content, and it was an illustration.
Yes.
And then she ended up joining the library board. She felt she felt that she was heard and
Yes.
was and understood. And then didn't she like pass out? Didn't she end up having to tell someone?
Yeah, it was people. So, she started off as, what everybody fears. Oh my God, here's somebody coming to say the library is promoting a racist stereotype, a negative stereotype in a children's book. This cannot be allowed. And then kind of we went through that process and said, well, here's our policies and here's how we think that compares. And yeah, we agree we need to increase things, but I'm going to write a newspaper column about it. And will you write one about it? I'll give my column to you for the following week. So the whole community starts talking about this issue. She came on the library board. She became the library president. Somebody came in to say, I cannot believe that you let my child check out an R-rated movie. My child, my sweet, innocent 17-year-old child. And she just looked him in the eye and she says, in this library, we are opposed to censorship. We believe in free speech. And I'm like, yes, we got you.
Yeah.
But it was also like, it was an educational thing for all across the community. It's like, are there stereotypes in literature? You bet they are. But is it as dangerous to say we're going to go through and purge the past without really knowing what we're replacing it with? That too is dangerous.
That was one of the things. One of the things that Amanda Jones described in her book was what was this internal struggle with what do we keep and what's harmful, and she specifically mentioned the Little House on the Prairie books, that were in her school library collection. She was a middle school librarian.
Yeah.
And she's people were saying, haven't you, what about the racist content in those? And all she could think was, I loved those books when I was a kid, right? And so she reread them with her 21st century sensibilities and thought, oh, geez. And then she thought, well, but if I take them off the shelf, isn't that censorship? I mean, that.
Yes, it is.
There's not easy answers. That's not easy answers. She did follow her school's collection development policy, which indicated that books that hadn't circulated in 5 years should be weeded out. And so she checked the circulation record. She said, people don't read these books anymore. So she removed them on that basis. But again, you were talking about how the library reflects the past. And I'm pretty sure that I told an anecdote in one of our earlier conversations about, finding, I wanted to read a book that was published in the 1950s, and it was in my library. Like, oh, good, because I wanted to read this. It wasn't something like that reflected anything like today's sensibilities, right? And so librarians take books off the shelf all the time. It's called weeding.
Yes, that's right.
But Amanda Jones took it out of her school library, but what she didn't do was go to her public library and demand that they remove all the copies. And maybe the public library doesn't need as many copies as it used to either. Maybe
I could remember.
It only needs one now.
I had a woman one time and she complained about a book called Should a Girl Kiss a Boy? And it was written for like about 11, 12-year-olds, and the answer was no, certainly not. But you could allow them to carry your books home for you. So a very kind of a 1958 perspective, which is the date of the book. And she complained about this because teenagers shouldn't be thinking about kissing. And I looked at this and I said, for the first time, I'm going to remove a book when somebody challenges it, but not for the reason you think. I'm going to remove it because now 10-year-old girls are having their menstruation cycles beginning. And this book is so dated and so out of place that you are really not going to like the book I replace it with.
So one of the issues that Pam and I, well, you actually contradicted yourself a little bit too, because you said, "Oh, well," you gave an example of I think it was the book uh, about the people who were cooking for George Washington,
Right.
and that it just,
For George Washington.
yeah, and that it was the publisher actually, pulled it. The publisher
Right.
pulled it,
Mhm.
and that you tried to go to the local bookstore to actually grab one, and it was gone there too. And you said, well, technically that's not censorship. But then later in the book, you were like, oh, I'm starting to second guess myself. Maybe these kinds of things are censorship. And we were wondering, when we were thinking about what we might ask you, we're wondering, like, where are you you don't have to commit. Where are you today, though? In this moment, where are you? Because you could change your mind,
Well, and thank you for that grace, because I hope it's the case that we're still learning and we get to change our opinions about this stuff. On the one hand, I said that if I write a book and I get nothing but terrible reviews for it, do I have the right to remove that book from the marketplace? I'm protecting my reputation. It's like, oh, I don't like this. I'm not, maybe too late to clean it up, but I want to remove the ongoing torrent of negative comments. That's not censorship. That's just having to respond to what's going on critically. But I think it's also the case that, so when something comes along like Facebook, and you talk about being on X, I dropped out of X when Musk took it over. After being on Facebook for a long time and seeing that I had to go in like on a weekly basis for a while and reset my privacy settings, I said, I don't like what's happening with this. I don't like what I'm reading in the paper about how misinformation deliberately promulgated through Facebook is a threat to democracy. And so I really dropped down off of that too. Do we get to the point where these things represent something like an equivalent governmental threat to safety, to free speech? And I think that as those monopolies get larger and larger, they look more and more like government.
We have a question on the chat. I guess it's from one of the people online. It says, is putting books in age-appropriate places, libraries and schools censorship? Well, I know what my answer to that is. I would say,
yeah, what was your answer, Pam?
Things belong in, children's books belong in the children's collection, and adult books don't belong in children's collection. That's my answer.
Yeah, where I start with that one is I say that everybody always assumes that what determines what's adult and children is content, and that is not true. Some of the most difficult subjects are often easily and even better handled in children's literature than they are in adult literature. What defines the difference is the format. And so I remember when Heather's Two Mommies came out. When it first came out, it was not a children's book. It was written for adults, and you could tell that by the format. It was mostly text. There was very few illustrations, and people would say it's not a children's book. I'm not going to sit down and read this to my child. They were right. So then more versions came out. The current version of Heather's Two Mommies is a children's book because it's simpler language. There's a page on each, or there's a picture on each page, and it's of a length that you can get through with a child under the age of 4. So the issue that I find is so the way librarians arrange their collections is by intended audience. We take kids' books, we put them in a kid's format. And when a parent comes in and says, well, this is not appropriate for my child, my 4-year-old child, you say, your 4-year-old child can't read. You would have to read it to them. And that's the reason we put it here, is to put all these things together. And so when somebody says, well, then put it in a parents only section. And I have tried that a couple of times in my library career. And what that means is nobody uses it. And so you've got a really good book that we've managed to hide in such a way that no one is going to find it. And so I'm perfectly comfortable to say that kids' book belong in the kids' area, adult books belong in adult areas. But now, and there's like court cases around this too, where somebody comes in and challenges a book to say, well, it's a children's book, but I want it in the adult collection because of the content.
Right.
And that's what I mean by age appropriate, is the content. And a court case found about this that's censorship. That's deliberately hiding a material so that it is not going to be used. And now in my library, I have people come up and say, well, you have books that are manga, they are adult graphic novels. And what if a child were to pick one up? So it's not enough to put it in an adult collection. You have to put it in a locked room, and you have to check their ID before they get into it. And this is the kind of discussion. Well, that's what I mean by age appropriate, what I decide I don't want my child to see. And so I come back and say, putting books in age appropriate places, if we mean format, is perfectly correct. It's industry standard. That's what we're supposed to do. But today, often the language of age appropriateness is being used in a variety of states and in school settings to say, hide them all together, or require written permission, or the parent has to be with you, and you bet it's censorship.
Yeah, I remember, taking my own child to the library when he was young, and I always told him he could read whatever he wanted whenever he was ready to read it. But
Children reading too much.
he
What a
wasn't
panic.
old enough to go to the library by himself either.
Yeah.
So I was there to help if he picked something out that I didn't think he was ready to understand. We looked at it together, and talked about it like a parent would.
Yeah.
And I told him too. I said, and once he got old enough to go by himself, I was like, okay, well, if you find anything there that you don't understand, you ask me, like he was going to do that, right?
Well, and as I say to many people, it's like reading about sex is the safest thing there is. Reading about it is about as good as it gets. And the part that I always, my pushback is when somebody comes to say, I'm opposed to government and you're pushing an agenda, and I want to have all these things in place that prevent children from having access to content. And I say, if you really believe the government is too intrusive, why are you putting us in the middle of this? Talk to your kid. Talk to your child. Our job is not to prevent people from reading. Our job is not to preserve the innocence of a child. Our job is to prepare children to become adults.
One of our favorite stories from the book is the Brussels sprouts story. I mean, that analogy is just spot on. So I was wondering, would you retell it real quickly here?
Well, what I've concluded, the way as I think about my book, I've boiled it down to say there are 4 reasons that people challenge books. And the first one, the Brussels sprouts example, is personal prejudice, often informed by childhood trauma. You see something in a library that triggers you, you get upset about it, you want it to go away. And in my case, when I was a kid, I picked up Brussels sprouts for the very first time, bit into them. They were hot, probably canned, no doubt. And it tasted awful, and I spat it out. And my father said, you can't leave the table till you clean your plate. And so I had all these, nasty vegetables on my plate. I put some under dropped them on the floor. I hid some under potato peels. But ultimately, there were some that by now were cold. And the only thing worse than a hot Brussels sprout is a cold Brussels sprout. And I had to chew it. And so every time I think about this, I'm filled with anger and resentment. And so I go to the grocery store, and there's a sign right out in the open, like it's not a problem, Brussels sprouts for sale. And so I go up to the manager, and granted I knew him, and I said, how don't I deserve the right? See if you recognize any of this language in today's challenges. Don't I deserve the right not to come into a place and be offended by something? And he thought about it for a while, and he looks at me and he says, nobody comes to the grocery store because we don't have what they don't want. And I realized, boy, that's brilliant for a library. You don't go to a library because all the books that I dislike aren't here, so I'm going to go there. Well, no, you go because you are curious about something. You want something. You are seeking that. And so the job of the library is not to shut down all those choices. It's to offer people things that they like, even if I don't.
Well, we've used that analogy several times in the rest of our lives.
Oh, yeah, good. The Brussels sprout example.
Yes, we love the Brussels sprout example. So to go back to the this sort of like what censorship. One of the things that Pam and I did an entire podcast on, and that was on a panel that we did that was brought up by another panelist, was pre-publication censorship.
Yeah.
And also the what are they called, Pam? The reviews that librarians use.
Oh, so professional book reviews, like in Kirkus and the
Kirkus,
Library Journal.
Yeah. Library Journal.
And sort of the process of sort of pre-weeding. So that, so anyway, I was wondering if maybe Pam can describe it a little bit better, and then maybe you can talk about it.
Yeah. So what one of the panelists had done a lot of research on reviews, on library reviews, and discovered that that almost all of them, like well over 90% of any book that gets reviewed in the things that librarians typically use, Kirkus reviews and Library Journal, particularly, probably, over 90% of them were positive reviews. So what she did a little digging and discovered, that there's this sort of like, yeah, we're not, all these other books, they didn't even make it to the level of the editor of the publication said, no, I'm not even going to send this out for review. I don't like it. I don't like it. So, and that, as a librarian, I did this all the time. Like, I'm not sure about this book. Let me see what the review says. And then, let me check a second review. And the second review was always good. But I was only going to get good ones. So I guess that was like she was saying, like there's this censorship that we don't even know about, right? I didn't know about it as a librarian. I just, review. It's got good reviews.
Well, I'll see if I can take that maybe one step deeper because I'm seeing something else happening. So when I wrote my book, I was, going around and speaking about censorship generally, and I wound up giving a pre-pub copy to an African-American author. And I said, love to have a blurb if you're able to do that. And he read it and he said, I'm typing you back here with some concern because I can't recommend this book because you have a couple of things here that I feel are insulting to African Americans. And he said, these are the specific passages. So this is an unconscious bias on your part. And so I was like, thank you so much. I would rather be critiqued by my friends than excoriated by my enemies. And so I kind of went through and I made some changes and I said, so what do you think about this? He said, okay, that's great. Now I'm happy to give you an endorsement. Well, this kind of thing, I feel is like, okay, I'm just trying to make sure that I'm, kind of correcting for biases that I have. But what many publishers are doing, because they're so afraid of these kinds of challenges now, is that they are requiring their authors to send out everything to have it vetted by whatever group that they're talking about. And after a certain while here, it's like, if you're white, you can only write about white people. If you're black, you can only write about black people. And it's like, what a diminishment of the curiosity of the author. Or an actor, same kind of thing happens, to go out and explore the world and try voices. You may fail badly, but it's like, do we really want to just say, shut up about experiences just when you have only begun to understand it and explore it? Or can we only speak about our own experiences? So I think that's a hot issue, and I get, once again, no easy resolution to it. It's like we have to listen to each other's stories.
I've been thinking about that a lot because I also teach elementary Spanish at the university where I work, and I would often have an assignment where I'd have my students read a children's book in Spanish because they've got repetition and pictures that will help them to understand, and so. A lot of the books, some of the books were just like translations of Little Red Riding Hood or something, when they already knew the story and it really didn't have cultural content. But when we would look at books with cultural content, then there was, I'd ask them to think about like who wrote the book, what's the author's background, and I guess we just talked about it as an insider-outsider question. This was, I remember having one of the elementary ed professors come and talk to my class about that, about insider-outsider. But I don't even think that conversation, it seems like you can't even have that conversation anymore.
Well, I'll put another spin on this one. It's like one of the things that fascinates me when you look at banned books across the century, the same books show up over and over and over again, but they're challenged for different reasons. So you've got Huck Finn, or when it first came out, it was like, well, this is, low class speech. It's not elevating in any way. And then now it's like the N word appears in there very, very frequently. And so I realized that classics, meaning books that endure, seem to have this special certification where they can, what makes a classic is that it can piss off one generation after another. It's like it's not like, oh, this one came in, it's innocuous and so it lasted. There's something about it that engages you and arouses this sort of anger, or it forces you to rethink, and that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. So I don't want to purge all that stuff that upsets us from collections, because it's probably the ones that are going to last.
It makes us reflect on our own. These are the books that make us reflect on our own humanity.
Right.
And that's uncomfortable, right? And so I think there's an element of that, even if, the discomfort, like you said, if discomfort of the age across the ages, that we find something to feel that something disquieting about them, and that's what makes them great, maybe.
And I was surprised, even here, like in Colorado, in Elizabeth, in a school district, they had like 13 books that they said were harmful to minors and had to be pulled immediately. And one of them was Forever by Judy Blume, written in 1975. Is it really the case that a teenager can't handle a book written in 1975 for teenagers?
I read that book in the 70s when
Yeah.
it came out. I was a teenager.
Wow.
I handled it fine.
Yeah.
And you know what? My parents knew I was reading it, and they said, "Oh, I'm glad you're reading."
Yeah. Well, that's a big thing, right? That parents get all in a tizzy, when especially this sort of like middle school age, and frankly, like, just be happy your kid's reading, because a lot of kids at that age, especially boys, are not
Right.
reading at all.
Right.
And this has serious, long-term consequences in terms of your lexical, your vocabulary.
Capacity. Yeah, vocabulary.
Exactly. And so and then that influences your reading, writing, oral fluency, which then means that you have to attend to whatever you're reading, writing, or talking about so much more closely, that you have less working memory, you have less attentional resources to process the bigger picture, the larger
That's really good.
message and everything. So this has long-term consequences. We need to be reading more across our lifetimes, and that's, one of your main points is read more, right? Don't read less, read more, even if you don't know, if you don't like it.
I would say especially read some stuff you don't like. That's how else are we going to be able to talk to people about our differences?
Well, and I love this idea about the family book club. I mentioned this. It's like, so you have an idea as a parent, and again, as a parent myself, nothing but compassion for the great difficulty of dealing with these life transitions where you're losing your baby and you want them back, and it's about that. It's about love and loss and grief. But I think it's often the case, like the parents say, well, I think this is appropriate for you, and you give it to your child and they say, that's appropriate for me when I was in 4th grade, and I'm now 17. It's like we have very different ideas about the world, and it's eye-opening to the parent to see what the child thinks is appropriate.
One of the things that I think is, I've never had children of my own, but one of the markers seems to be like a sense of humor. It's like once they start to learn to use the language to make jokes, or that they see things that, like, they do see things in different light and can make fun of themselves or their previous thinking on something. And I was thinking, like, when I work with undergraduate students, when I know they understand the material is when they know it well enough to make a joke about it.
Oh, that's really good.
And so now they're really understanding, right? Because they can, And so again, if you read something you don't like, or something that's not age appropriate or whatever, there's still value in sort of being able to have the conversation about that thing, and even whatever it is, article or book or whatever, and joke about it, and there's still real value in that. It shows a level of sophistication.
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you another story here, and this is about my daughter. And so when I would get challenges to children's books, I would use my children as unpaid consultants, and I would kind of read it to them to say, what do you think about this? And I remember I got a challenge to the book Shrek, and this is the one before the movie, and it's a different story. But the complaint was this book promotes the supernatural as an explanation, or supernatural powers can come in and solve these kind of problems. And so very, very serious kind of a complaint. And I read it to my daughter, and she looked at me with such pity in her eyes. And she says, "Daddy, it's supposed to be funny." And what killed me about this was like the 3-year-old got it and the 35-year-old didn't. And so I feel like, many of the challenges that come on both the right and the left are so humorless.
Right.
There's like no
Right.
human, there's no, so God, that's pretty funny. And often this stuff is pretty funny.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think about like when people say, "Well, kids don't understand," and I'm thinking, I think about myself. Like I remember understanding when I was 4.
Right.
I did, and I knew magic wasn't real. And,
Yeah, right.
one of the things people would when Twilight was popular, people were like, "Oh, why do you let your child read that?" And I'm like, because he can recognize the difference between fantasy and reality.
Okay, well, here's one. When I wrote a little bit about fairy tales, which kind of fascinated me, but we had a copy of the Grimm Brothers fairy tales that came through. And so I thought, oh, interesting. I want to see what the original looks like. So again, 4-year-old daughter now. And I'm reading Cinderella to her. And in the original version, at the end, these evil stepsisters, the crows come down out of the sky and they peck out their eyes.
Yes.
And they take the evil stepmother and they put her in red hot iron boots, and she has to dance until her legs are bloody stumps. And I'm reading this to my 4-year-old and I'm thinking, oh my God, what do you do? And you say, do you stop and go, how about them Berenstain Bears? Or, do you try to change the subject? Or I say, well, we'll get through it and see what happens. And I finish, and my daughter reaches out and grabs my forearm and she said, read it again. Well, why is that? And the reason is the world is sometimes kind of frightening, and there are things out there, and children need to develop these imaginative antibodies to the illnesses in the world, name their fears, and begin to work out strategies to deal with.
And not only that, but to feel that that was justified in the story. And this idea of crime and punishment and distributive justice and stuff. It's like there's kids have a very acute sense of fairness.
I think that's right.
And so there's a period of time in their lives when they're extraordinarily concerned with fairness. And so, you must have hit it just right, when she was, when she was learning about that, and that some people get their just desserts, and they think that that's the right, there are rights and there are wrongs, and there's a period of time in which it's very clear. And then they get into the gray,
Well, and it's
that's
also
where we are, right? We're talking, all of what we're talking about is a gray area.
Why do people watch horror movies and stuff? It's because there's something thrilling about being scared, And so it's like, again, so much of what I see when people try to censor things is just to diminish the human capacity, to make it so small. Everything is serious. And in the first book I wrote about censorship, I said, not every Marx Brothers movie is a reliable guide to social etiquette. It's just not. And some stuff is just for fun, and that's part of the human experience too.
Yeah. Fun. Let's have some fun. So I guess there's a couple things I want to talk about before we get out of time here. One, so you talked about, why people censor, and, the idea that one reason is that they're offended, right? And don't we have the right not to be offended? But one of the other things you said about why people censor is the self-centered perspective, that one's own perspective is more important or more correct than anyone else's. And, as we were talking about what kind of questions to ask you, and I thought, well, that is me. I think I'm more right. Isn't that all of us?
Unless you be very
censor, I know better than everybody else.
Right.
93% of us think we're better drivers than anyone else.
Right.
I am a better driver than everybody else. Okay, don't get me started.
I remember in a business class, I did the same thing where 93% of the people in the class thought that they were better than everybody else ethically.
Yeah. Well, it's called the better than average effect. That's
right,
exactly what it's called in psychology.
Yeah.
So there you go. Yeah. So yeah, how do we? This is something that comes up a lot on our podcast, and within ILV and everything, how do we avoid becoming what we dislike or what we're, what we're raging against? And I, if you have any any thoughts or reflections on that, how do we check ourselves on this, better than average effect?
Well, I tell you, I ran across something that's very interesting. We're doing an experiment called the Human Library. You probably have heard about it. It originated in Denmark. And the idea is you find people who are a little outside the norm and you call them books. And you have an event at the library, and I sit down and say, okay, so at one of our first human library, we had someone who has been incarcerated since the age of 11, and he was in his mid-40s before he finally got out. And so, kind of coached him to say, talk about, chapter 1, this is where I came from. Chapter 2, the first big life experience. Chapter 3, where I am. And you can say, I don't know what the book is still being written. But then the way people read them is they ask questions. And it was so fascinating to say that the purpose ultimately is to stop judging people until you have heard their story. So that's one kind of approach. The second one is something that's livingroomconversations.org. And it's a free website. And the idea is that there's something like 150 genuinely controversial topics. So you take something like abortion. And so you have a session where, let's say there are 25 people come in and there are 5 tables of 5. And you get a piece of paper. It says, these are the ground rules, is that you will have a chance to speak without interruption for 2 minutes. And you just say, here's my interest in the topic, here's my experience with it. And then the next person who cannot interrupt you and isn't there to argue now has 20 minutes to tell their own story. And it just goes all the way around. And then the second round is to say, having heard this, what would you like to say? Not to argue with people, but how does this change your thinking? Go all the way around again. And then the third round is to say, what's your takeaway from today's meeting? And I think that the pernicious part about how argumentative we are, about how we keep wanting to put ourselves above other people, is we are talking and we are not listening. And the purpose of this living room conversations is to listen to each other. And that's the only way that I have found to shake yourself out of your own prisons of the mind, is to watch somebody else, listen to somebody else.
Thanks. So the other thing, it's we get into this gray area, and how our own thoughts have changed. I've been really interested in book banning for, ever since I was in library school in the early 1990s. And, I remember talking about, how to create a challenge form and what kind of conversations to have. And, and I remember, somebody saying, about reading the whole book, like, should we ask the person to read the whole book? Right. And somebody said, well, if they're offended by the book, why would you make them keep reading it? And I thought, well, that's fair. Yeah, that's a fair question, And so I kind of thought, no, I wouldn't request that. But in today's, I've totally gone a 180 on that one. In today's climate,
I have too.
Book,
I have too.
They're not even reading any of it now.
Well, some of the challenges I'm getting. We had a woman who comes in, and she's a childless woman in her 70s. Okay, and she takes this book that's an adult graphic novel. She finds an image, and she says, "This child is being raped." And if you read the book, it's perfectly clear that did not happen. It did not happen. And so now the person who files us in, if we do a reconsideration, I'm supposed to pay 6 people to read the entire book when she couldn't be bothered to look at more than a panel. And it's like, at some point, it's like, well, is that fair? Is that, the book costs $12 to buy, and it turns out that I'm spending $350 to review that purchase request for someone who didn't bother to read the book themselves. It's like, that's not reasonable.
Okay, but you then also say that if a Holocaust denier wants you to add a book to the collection, you have no reason to read the whole book. You kind of know what it says, so you don't need to read it. So again, it's a gray area. There's not easy answers, right?
I don't have a perfect answer that's going to work for every situation, but I do know is that like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, And I feel like if you're going to do that, like about the Holocaust denier, it's like, well, what are your premises? And there were 3 or 4, and they were very easily overturned. It's like, okay, so I'm not going to buy a book about why the moon is made out of green cheese. Just no, probably. Or if I do, it might go in the fantasy and not in the science section.
Right.
One of the things that maybe we should go to the chat here. Are certain schools exempt from free speech regulations? For example, can a religious school pick and choose their books to exclude or put in different sections? And I think
well, that's an interesting question, because up until now I would have said they do have far greater latitude. And the reason for that is that they're not governmental entities, and that free speech doesn't apply to everybody, it applies to the government. And so if you have censorship that's happening, where a deliberate suppression of a viewpoint in a public school, you would say, no, that's censorship. You have to be open to this. But if you're a religious school, well, your purpose is to promote that religion, and you may not choose to cover other things. Does that argument get complicated as we see greater and greater school vouchers, where people are taking public money and giving them to private religious schools? And I think at that point, okay, here we go again, more gray area. And I think so it could, out of the gate, I think that certain schools are free from governmental restrictions. But if they're accepting governmental money, it might want to occur to them that maybe that those restrictions come along with the cash.
Mm-hmm. So one of the other things that we haven't talked about, that to kind of circle back around to where we started with the American Library Association and the Office of Intellectual Freedom, you described that really as sort of like the smoke, like the fire watchers, the people in the towers, right, that are like looking for little puff of smoke or something, and that there could be sort of a brush fire that's under that we haven't seen, and that may have already destroyed part of the forest. And right. So I guess I'd like, and Pam too, both of you, to sort of talk about Pam started out saying, there's 10,000, requests in just this short period, a period of time. What are we not seeing? What's your sense of what's going on? And even, Pam talked about like soft censorship, and, so what do you think's there that we're not seeing, the underbrush?
I think we've gone from a little smoke in the fire. Like I said, I dealt with 250 challenges, but the last year that I was a director at Douglas County, we checked out 8 million books. That's just a little puff of smoke, right? So it's not anything serious. But when you see this conflagration spread across the nation, where now we are having legislation, so that's official governmental action that removes 3.5 billion books from access to children, things moved fast. So what is it that made that happen? And to back up a bit, to say the 4 reasons people challenged, the first one was personal prejudice. I don't like this, and I don't think anybody else should see it. Second one is that parental panic. I'm freaking out because my kids are growing up and I don't want them to. It's demographic panic, which is that suddenly the national story isn't just about me, and I don't like that. To this final one that I think is very worrisome, and that's an authoritarian takeover by political powers. They want power, and they are using the apparatus of government to achieve it. And so the specific trigger that I saw in American society was really Moms for Liberty. And it was using all the apparatus of political partisanship and political pressure and fundraising and kind of trying to seize control of public entities. That happened really fast.
It did happen really fast.
Yeah, and I think that's worrisome to see how rapidly deep cultural institutions, schools, libraries, media can be dismantled almost overnight using political levers.
Yeah, I thought about this a lot, this idea of like a trend spotting, right? That the top 10 list that the ALA puts out every year, the top 10 banned books, for the last 10 years or so, the numbers were going down. Like it was
Right.
500 and some odd books, then 400 and some odd. It's down to like in the 200s. And I'm thinking, oh, that's a good trend. I mean, I hate that any books are being banned, but that's I like that downward trend. And then it shot up like crazy. And then I thought I was thinking about this idea of the smoke was a warning, and I thought, you know what? Probably it was about 15 years ago. I remember I noticed on the top 10 list that the first 4 books were had LGBTQ themes,
Yep.
and I did a presentation at the university about these books, and I tried to do some educational programming. I remember talking at a library conference about it, and then there was no way I could have known what was really coming of that. But it was certainly, the trend was obvious, right? Here's 10 books. The first 4 on the list have LGBTQ themes. And I don't even know what I would have done. Like, I don't even know what I would have done differently. Because it's like, if we're talking about Forrest, like, it's not just Bambi's mother is dead. Bambi's dead. Thumper's dead. Flower's dead. They all got killed, right?
Right.
Took them all. I don't even know what do we do when we spot these trends? I'm not.
Well, so here's the thing that my current thinking about this stuff is that what is the appropriate response to a naked grab for political power that seizes from the people the right to exercise what up until now have been guaranteed freedoms? And the only thing that I know to do for this, and that's kind of what I focus on at the end of the book, is that you have to get out of just the institutional bubble, and it has to be a presentation to the larger community. In almost every community that I've seen, even these big conflagrations of challenges, if you put the word out to the whole community and you say, we want our teenagers to come in and talk to us, what are you reading? Well, they come in and they say, here in Colorado, we want to have one of the highest teen suicide rates in the nation. And for LGBTQ youth, it's 5 times higher. And so someone comes into the meeting, first you got the parents saying, by God, this is age inappropriate, you got to hide this. And then a teenager comes in to say, I was going to kill myself. And I picked up this book that told my story. And it gave me courage. It allowed me to continue. And you have the rest of the people go, wow, that's a real life story. And in fact, in survey after survey, 80% of people in whatever power are opposed to censorship. And so the fact that we have this being imposed on us by ever more extreme members of parties, the only way around it is not to say, well, it's one really strong library director or one great library board or even library policies. It's a community discussion where we reclaim government to serve the people that it's supposed to serve.
And you know what? So that might have it reached one person or 2 people or 20 people who found themselves in a story that gave them hope. And you know what? The other 1,000 people, 2,000, 20,000 people who read it, it didn't turn them gay.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like this is true with all of our book with with what right there, whether it's more academic work or whether it's a children's book and everything in between. There's a reason why we don't all read the same thing, because not everything touches us. Not everything means something to us. We find different. I can find in Robert Parker's Spencer novels, I can find a bit of me in Spencer and in Hawk and in The Girlfriend. I can't remember her name right now, but in Louis L'Amour books, I can find something for myself, even though there's no strong female character in most of these books.
Because you could find a trait.
I can find a trait. Yes. And so if we quit focusing on, whatever their sexuality is or what color their skin is, and get back to why we read, for just to escape. We're not always reading to find ourselves in a book. We're reading to not find ourselves in a book, right? And if it doesn't resonate with me, it is not going to contaminate me. I'm not going to be be spoiled because of, having held this book and read some of the words inside of it. And thank heavens there are a variety of books that can, touch certain people's lives in meaningful ways. And
Well, and one of the things I talked about in the book too is I feel like there are at least two things that drive people to a library. One of them is the case that I would give is you walk in as part of a biracial family and you're looking for books that reflect your experience. And if you can't find anything, you say this institution isn't for me. I'm looking for something that represents my life, and that's a thirst, and it's real, and it's important in a society. But just as important as somebody comes in to say, in the story I told is the white little girl who comes in and falls in love with a book about African fairy tales, folk tales. And these stories tell her, impart a value that she couldn't find in our culture. So you're both looking for representation. You're looking for stories about yourself, but you're also looking about stories that expand your understanding of who you could be. And that means you have to read about other people.
When you finish the book by giving, you have 7 ideas for people, and we're just sort of wondering, any thoughts on those? Anything else? What are those? You could real quick run through those 7 things, and then if you have any other ideas.
Well, most of my ideas like laugh, restore the sense of humor, read more, talk about it more. Contribute to your local newspaper, subscribe to it, speak up, and all that kind of voting things. But I think the thing that I missed, and the thing that I'm grappling with now as we get into an election season, I've had our county commissioners kind of weigh in and start appointing hostile board members who will try to undo our policies. And I realized the skill that I don't have is community organizing. And that's something that I think I really didn't understand the power of that, because that's the only response to a political movement, is it has to be equally organized at the community level. And so I have some learning to do about that.
So I guess I would ask as final thoughts, like I know you listened to at least some of our podcasts that we did. Was there anything that we talked about that you felt like you needed to comment on, or you misunderstood what I said in the book?
What triggered me? Yeah, you had said at one point, and I think it was you, Elizabeth, about how I was being hypocritical because of something I'd said about social media.
And then like a paragraph later, you said, "Thank heavens." You can't really
hide it because it's out there in the internet.
Yeah.
I contain multitudes. I have many contradictions. I don't think it's hypocrisy. I think it's just that there's two different sides of it.
This conversation helped me to understand, where all of this, we're talking about gray areas, right? And I mean, we all know that we have internal struggles ourselves. That book stinks, and I don't think anybody should read it. But if somebody wants to,
and I don't know if this happens to you, but and I wrote a newspaper column for 24 years. You read it and read it and read it. You think you got everything put exactly the way you want. It shows up in print. It's like, oh God, how could I miss that? And so I feel like I continue to go through this. It's like there are things in this book. It's like, how could you say that? That's so obviously wrong or sloppy or something. And that's just, I think, the nature of being an author is that you're constantly editing and revising your previous opinions till it finally gets right, and then the whole world changes.
Well, this is an aspect of, how 93% of us, think we're better drivers or whatever, and we think that we're more right than other people. When faced with, I'm kind of fascinated by my own hypocrisies. They happen, with some, and once you start looking for them, you're like, oh no, there's another one. And so, it really wasn't so much of a criticism as just sort of this sort of awareness of this gray area. And this is hard. This is not easy. Your book is a comfortable read, but it is still thought-provoking. So it's not like reading a philosophy book. But what comes across is not, you don't try to make it sort of deceptively easy to address this problem, I guess.
Right.
So
right.
those little hypocrisies, those little places where you contradict yourself. I actually don't think those are flaws or whatever. I think that that's a reflection of the difficulty that we face. And
I do think, like, I have tried to think deeply about the issue of intellectual freedom,
and that shows.
And what I wind up with is that it's my hope to bring everybody to the same high level of confusion that I enjoy.
Yes. Yeah. And so we need, again, just like more, we need to read more and everything. We also need to talk more about this.
Yeah,
And
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one of the things that I really took away from one of those stories that I told about Darby, Montana, there was a difficult conversation in a very rural, remote area that was all white ranchers, and they brought in a Muslim Montanan to talk about what it meant to grow up Muslim. And at the end, the woman that wound up as the main quote in the newspaper article, she said, all of us, despite all the polarity going on around us, we have such a thirst for meaningful conversation, for meaning. And I think that somehow that has to be the way through. It's not just who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, but what does this mean?
All right. Well, thank you. I think we've come to a consensus about how confused we are about the
Okay,
issue.
that's good. Finally, something certain. Well, thank you so much. It's been fun to talk to you both, and I really appreciate it. And it was fun for me to listen in to you poking through my work to see what it provoked in you. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.